Yes, so that's the title of task 15, which is indeed focused on building integrated photovoltaics. For those of you who are maybe not so familiar with it, the difference between building applied PV and building integrated PV is that in building integrated PV, the PV modules act as part or as a construction element. So they need to fulfill some kind of building function, being either a rain screen, being a structural element, or, for example, forming part of the envelope in some other way. There's a lot of different products out there. So you can either have BIPV roofs, BIPV facades. These are the two most common applications. But you can also have external shading elements. You can have railings. All this can be classified as BIPV as long as, in most cases, it is designed for this dual functionality as a building element and it forms part of the building in itself. This also means that many of these products need to fulfill construction sector requirements. So we're not only trying to fulfill the PV requirements, but also some requirements on the construction side, which can often give challenges in certification and so on. There is a huge potential for BIPV, but it's still a niche market. So we've seen some development over the last few years, and we expect that this development will increase in the next few years. On the one hand, due to the increased need for decarbonization of the building sector. So buildings make up a huge load of our carbon emissions in the world. So we need to reduce that, and there's a huge ambition for that, where BIPV can play a significant role by enabling localized renewable energy production. There's also some opportunities for the grid. So it was mentioned earlier by Ken that we have in some cases grid congestion and thereby co-localizing production with consumption through building integrated PV, we can reduce this grid congestion. Um, and However, there are some challenges that come along with all this. I mentioned before we need to fulfill construction element requirements, but also we need to fulfill aesthetic requirements if we want to include our PV in buildings. We don't want all buildings to look the same. We want to have a certain design element to it. And then there are also performance differences to standard freestanding PV in regard to limited ventilation, so a reduced cooling effect of the modules and thereby higher operating temperatures. We have more frequent shading and other effects that can happen. So in IEA PVPS task 15, we're trying to tackle a lot of these different problems. So it's a very diverse task with around 60 active experts from more than 15 countries with 5 subtasks, as you can see on the slide here. The first one is focused mostly on market aspects and regulation. The second one is mostly the research aspect, so looking into fire safety, glare, solar heat gain, shading, and different kinds of colored and non-colored BIPV performance and characterization. And I'll come to a lot of these topics and show you some highlights during the presentation. And then we have three more subtasks focused on digitalization and building information modeling, product innovation and long-term behavior, where we're looking a little bit into how does the reliability of BIPV compare to non-building integrated PV. And then finally, a subtask on training, dissemination, and stakeholder involvement, basically to boost and really drive forward this implementation of BIPV in the market. And for that, we need a good education also of people in the construction sector who actually have to bring these BIPV products into the buildings themselves, which is a huge challenge at the moment. So I'll just go through a few highlights of work that has been done in the last year. Part in the first subtask is concerns itself with sustainability regulations, which on the one hand provide an opportunity for BIPV due to, for example, the few years old Energy Performance of Buildings Directive of the EU, which basically states that during this decade, all new and renovated buildings should start to be solar ready. Doesn't really say what that means, but it basically means that we should be able to put solar on almost all buildings. and it needs to be implemented in national building codes. And Denmark has done that to some extent. But on the other hand, we also have to compete with some other requirements of this Energy Performance of Buildings Directive, which states that we need to keep our carbon emissions in a certain range. And for that, we have guidelines according, for example, to this EN standard for sustainability assessment, which again is implemented in national regulations in different ways and small different peculiarities. One of the big challenges for PV in this regard, PV forming as part of the building and therefore needing to be considered in the building emission calculations, is that we have a nominal lifetime or a promised performance warranty of 25 years. And according to the standard, we also need to take that into account for replacement. So basically, you need to account for twice the system in your calculations because you sort of have to account for replacement after 25 years, even though we know that many PV systems are still working quite well after 30 years. There is also the issue that CO2 replacement can only be done on the expected or the forecast energy grid. So we have huge ambitions to transition to renewable energies, and with the green grid, we can place almost no CO2. So that is sort of limiting the effect of PV in the grid. And when you apply that, in addition to some of the EPDs we currently get and the regulations that are currently in place in Denmark, we arrive at a pretty challenging situation for PV with the sustainability regulations, where we have quite a significant portion of this budget that is allowed by law covered already with this BIPV or BAPV system. And that makes it challenging in some aspects to introduce BAPV. Or BIPV. And Sune, the colleague who will be giving a talk later on our colored BIPV project, presented some of these findings last week at an event at DAC. And we also published a paper on this at this year's EU PVSec conference, and you can find it. It's publicly available under this link here, which we'll get in the slides distributed after this talk. And then I want to talk about a second challenge that faces BIPV, but not only BIPV, but generally all PV, and that is glare, which is basically blinding reflections from sunlight due to the glazed surface of the PV modules. And it can range from various levels from discomforting, disturbing, even up to dangerous levels, even though this is very rare for PV modules. And we are currently finalizing a Task 15 report on glare legislation and assessment methods for BIPV and other PV modules and systems, which should be published in the next few months. And I'm just going to quickly go through some of the main topics in this report. In the first section, we provide sort of an acceptable definition of glare, trying to collect various different aspects of it, explain what are the physical causes behind it, and how we can categorize glare in proper ways. And then the main part of this report is a global mapping of glare regulations in the different IEA-PVPS member countries, where we have around 1 page of specific regulations for each country. Sorry. And you can then follow up with links to the specific regulations. And this is especially relevant for PV installers who branch out to different countries. Then we provide an overview of global assessment and simulation methods, parameters, thresholds, and so on, to provide a background also for regulatory sides, what is possible, what can be measured, so we do not have to rely on gloss measurements, which are pretty ineffectual to capture glare. And finally, an overview of glare mitigation strategies, which is based on some research work we've done in the last few years, basically showing that if you have a properly structured glass surface, you can pretty much avoid all glare. And the goal here is really to collect general information, distribute it, provide a baseline foundation of knowledge, inform about the glare regulations, and provide the basis for further standardization. And then finally, on the topic of colored BIPV, something we're very passionate about is that we have a few challenges in actual implementation. So on the one hand, the reproducibility of colored BIPV modules is a big challenge for production monitoring, but also matching to other materials. And here the question arose, what is the best method to measure color? There's a lot of them out on the market and in development. And for this, we're currently doing a measurement round robin to investigate some of the issues we might encounter here. And here are some results. You can look more into this on the presentation. It has also been presented at EU-PVSec. Basically, what we can see here is a color space of different measurements. And if our measurements were all to measure the same thing, all these circles would be overlapping here. As you can see, they are not. So just to make it very brief and short, color measurements on glazed PV modules are really difficult. They're really challenging also because most of these instruments are not designed for glazed surfaces, but for matte surfaces like the wall colors here. So there's a huge step to be taken to actually enable accurate color measurements, and that is something we're working on. And finally, we're also in the process of publishing a large BIPV data set for a blind modeling intercomparison, where we will benchmark different modeling approaches to see how they compare for different colored BIPV systems. And this will also be open to all modelers worldwide, so they can test their own skills and see how they stack up against the real performance data we measure in the field. Yes, and then finally, again, the reference to the Task 15 reports, which you can find online, especially to mention the Building Integrated Photovoltaics Handbook that was published earlier this year, which gives a really good comprehensive overview of what BIPV is and can be, and some case examples and best practice guidelines. And that's it from my side. Thank you everyone for listening, and I think now is soon time for a coffee break.